Good morning, everyone. I hope that you all are having a good week and that you had a good Easter yesterday. My name is Christopher Hurst, and today we're going to be looking at immunizations and the controversy behind them and vaccines specifically. Now, when I chose this topic, I had no idea how relevant it was going to become to current world affairs, but I've actually learned a lot while researching this, and I hope that you guys can learn something too today. So, just to give you a little overview of what vaccines are, what immunizations are, there are many different types of vaccines, and each vaccine for each disease is different and provides a different level and length of immunity. And some are yearly, and some are lifelong, and some are shorter than that or require boosters. But they all have a simple and common purpose for the most part. One of those purposes is to provide artificial immunity against disease. This is much safer than acquiring natural immunity, which you would get from the infection, and it allows people to have a specific immune response to a pathogen without acquiring the infection and the dangers that come along with that. Another purpose of vaccines is to decrease strain on the healthcare system. If there are more healthy people, then there would be less sick people having to go to the doctor and having to go into hospitals. And so this inadvertently would also lower healthcare costs because less people would be having to go and pay for all of those things. So that's just kind of a side effect, but also an intended effect of vaccines. And then specifically also to reduce infant and child mortality. Infant mortality is a big aspect of vaccines in this topic because a lot of the diseases that are vaccinated against affect children and infants most especially, and a lot of those vaccines that you receive are often received before you're 18 and a lot of times even younger than that. So the question is, why are infants so susceptible specifically to diseases and all of these things like that? And a lot of the reason is they lacked a lot of the active immunity that adults or older children would have. So this active immunity is gained either naturally from infection again or artificially from vaccination. Infants don't have a lot of this active immunity, and they have the innate immunity in their body, and they have the active immunity, but not towards anything specific. So infections can be very dangerous for infants because they've never encountered anything. They've never encountered any bacteria, most likely. Also, there's a quick transition from the in utero atmosphere to the outside world, which just further complicates and makes them more susceptible to illness and these things like that. And from neonatal infection, every year there are 700,000 deaths, which is another reason why this topic is so important and applicable to the modern world. But also, infants are especially susceptible to chemicals and things like that, which is a big reason why people who are against vaccination are so against it, because they believe that the extra adjuvants and chemicals that are in vaccinations that are supposed to help elicit an immune response would instead hurt the infants, and that there's too much going into an infant's body that isn't tested enough. These are just two examples of vaccines which have very different success stories. So the measles vaccine began in 1963, but it was widely distributed and became a lot more popular in the 1980s. Now, the British Infection Association acquired a lot of data on how successful the measles vaccine has been since its introduction. And they said that since its introduction, the measles vaccine has decreased measles mortality, measles-related mortality, by 95%, which is amazing. And just to give you a real number, that's 2.6 million to 134,000 deaths in 2015. The measles vaccine is one of the biggest success stories in vaccination, and it is a large reason why a lot of people today don't die from measles. On the other hand, a study done by the Center of International Children's Health in London for the diphtheria, tetanus, and acellular pertussis vaccine, or DTaP vaccine, they did a study on this vaccine and demonstrated that it was effective at birth at eliciting an immune response and working as intended at that point. But they also showed that it reduced response to pertussis and diphtheria antigens at 7 months. So this vaccine demonstrated that we can't necessarily take all of these things at face value. And it did show that it was effective at first, but later on, the infants actually had less immunity and less of a response to these specific antigens after receiving the vaccine. So these two stories kind of show that there's a lot more that needs to be studied, and that each vaccine is different, and that there's reasons to trust and not trust vaccines for sure. Thankfully, we've come a long way, but they originated, Edward Jenner, he performed the first vaccination all the way back in 1796. And this is a little gross, but he took the pus from a cowpox lesion on a milkmaid, and he inoculated an 8-year-old boy with that pus. And then after a few weeks, that 8-year-old boy showed to have some immunity to smallpox. Now, this was revolutionary for Jenner and a lot of people in that time. And after he performed this study, and among others, published all of them, he really laid the groundwork for modern vaccine technology and things like that. Now, it wasn't until 1885 when Pasteur developed what he called the rabies vaccine. Before this point, from 1796 all the way until 1885, vaccine only referred to taking cowpox and inoculating someone so that they would be immune from smallpox. However, in 1885, Pasteur kind of expanded the definition of a vaccine to include any disease and anything that you can be inoculated against. And then the golden age of vaccines began around 1950, and this just saw an unprecedented number of new vaccines and diseases that were highly prevalent becoming much less prevalent due to vaccination. The polio virus, for instance, that vaccine was developed in the 1950s. The measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine was developed in the 1960s, and then the varicella zoster, or the chickenpox vaccine, was developed in the 1970s. Now, it has changed over the years, but the purpose has, for the most part, remained constant of what a vaccine is meant to do. Thankfully, we have come a long way since Edward Jenner's day. I think that if I was told that I had to be injected with pus before attending school, I would be much less excited to receive a vaccination. However, the biochemical method has also kind of remained constant. So vaccination really involves introducing pathogenic particles into the body to elicit responses from immune cells, specifically responses from CD8 memory T cells. These cells are really important in active immunity because they allow specific immunity against an antigen or pathogen, which is much more effective at killing that antigen or pathogen. And so vaccination allows you to acquire those memory cells against that pathogen without receiving that infection again. It's meant to be safer than the infection. Now, just to say, everyone has innate immunity, which is the first response in the body against infection. And it's definitely very important. But as far as it goes for killing that infection, adaptive immunity is very important because it's very specific. Innate immunity is more broad. So vaccines aim at giving you that adaptive, specific immunity, again, without the infection, without introducing you to the harmful pathogen. There are definitely lots of types of vaccines, and this list is not exhaustive, but these 3 types are just the most applicable to our discussion. Live attenuated vaccines are vaccines that contain live pathogens, which have been made to be less pathogenic, less harmful, less virulent. So it's introducing a strain of live bacteria or viruses or whatever into the body to elicit an immune response, but these microorganisms have been made to be less harmful so that they won't hurt you. This vaccine produces the best immune response because it most closely mimics an actual infection. Now, this also comes with more danger because this vaccine has a higher likelihood of introducing an actual harmful pathogen into your body, or these live cells have the possibility of mutating and becoming virulent and harmful again. Examples of the live attenuated vaccine that we use today are the measles, mumps, and rubella, the MMR, and the varicella zoster, or the chickenpox vaccine. Inactivated vaccines are those that contain whole pathogens that are harmful, yet have been killed so that they can't spread in your body and can't infect other cells. These cells don't produce as much of an immune response as live attenuated, but they still produce a good enough immune response. However, they also come with a little bit of danger, not as much as live attenuated, but a little bit, if these cells weren't properly killed, and if there were live cells, they are the harmful cells that were introduced into your body, and so they could theoretically continue to infect you and give you that infection from a vaccine, which is intended for you to avoid that infection. Examples of inactivated vaccines that we still use today are the hepatitis A and the whole cell pertussis vaccines. And then finally, the subunit vaccines involve fragments of microorganisms that it introduces into your body so that immune cells can encounter antigens against that specific pathogen. This is the least dangerous because it's not introducing whole cells into your body, it's just introducing fragments, which don't really have the opportunity to infect cells because they're not a whole. However, it does produce the least amount of immune response and often requires another booster or only provides yearly immunity or things like that. An example of this would be the flu vaccine or the tetanus shot, which you can receive multiple times over your lifetime. Now, the CDC makes recommendations, and as vaccines are being developed and things like that, they have to oversee them and see how they're doing and and analyze their safety. So actually, in 2016, the CDC no longer recommended the use of live attenuated influenza vaccines. And this was over a decade after they had said to the public that it was safe. So this can cause a lot of mistrust in the public if they believe that something is safe, but the CDC then comes back and says it wasn't as safe as they thought, and can cause a lot of people to not trust vaccines, the safety of them specifically. Now, there are risks that come with each decision, whether you choose to vaccinate or choose not to vaccinate, and there are benefits that come with both as well. For vaccination, intended benefit would be a lower sick population. If vaccines work as intended and are working well, then again, less people will be sick and there would be less strain on the healthcare system, less healthcare costs in general, which is overall a good thing. However, there is a risk of adverse effects from vaccines. Again, this usually comes from chemicals that might be in the vaccine that you would be receiving when you're an infant or a child that a lot of people think haven't been researched enough to understand their safety. Or again, if a disease like a live attenuated virus or bacteria wasn't properly made to be less harmful or mutated again, you could receive that infection again. And so these adverse effects are things that you wouldn't receive if you hadn't gotten the vaccine, that you wouldn't just receive naturally. So again, vaccines, if intended to work, if working as intended, can be very awesome and very good, but they can have adverse effects that make their safety sometimes questionable. Non-vaccination, on the other hand, a good thing about that is immunity can still be gained naturally. You can still acquire an infection and fight off that infection and gain immunity, which we were meant to do in our bodies. However, there is a higher risk of mortality due to infection. Again, you won't have that active immunity, that specific immune response to that pathogen, which is vital in eliminating that pathogen from your body. So there is a chance that you could fight it off and that you would have that active immunity and that you'd be immune to that disease again. But there is also a chance that you wouldn't be able to fight it off and that you would succumb to that illness, which is something that vaccination tries to avoid. So as you can see, there's risks associated with either. Now, there have been multiple incidents that related to vaccines that have affected public opinion of vaccines greatly, and we're just going to go over a few of those today. So first, the polio vaccine was introduced in 1955, and this is one of the most horrible and worst cases of the adverse effects that vaccines can have in American history. 220,000 people were vaccinated against polio using this vaccine, and of those 220,000, 200 suffered from paralytic poliomyelitis, which causes extreme pain, muscle loss, and paralysis. This was, again, one of the worst incidents in American history of adverse effects of vaccines. And this is also the main reason why there's now a vaccine adverse reaction monitoring system in the US, so that the safety of these vaccines can be constantly monitored, and the, again, safety of the public can be constantly monitored. But this caused a lot of people to lose some faith in vaccines and see that they weren't as amazing as people might put them out to be. Then in 1998, there was a study posted in The Lancet that linked the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine with autism and said that there was a causal relationship between those two. I'm sure a lot of us have heard about this incident. It was highly popularized because of its controversial nature, but this caused a lot of people in the public to, again, lose faith in vaccines and see that maybe they weren't as safe as they originally thought. Now, a lot of this data in this study was later proven to be completely false, and that relationship was proven to be non-existent between MMR and autism. But the public opinion was still very hurt toward vaccines, for sure. Finally, and most recently, the Changxing incident was in China, and it occurred when it was in 2017, actually. Changshen Biotechnologies produces a lot of vaccines over in China. And in 2017, their titer counters on their diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus shot was shown to be not effective. And so a lot of these vaccines that they had produced for this DPT vaccine were not measured correctly. And a lot of these vaccines were actually injected into patients and were given to patients. Then, not even a year later, they were shown to have falsified a lot of their records and not become accustomed to government regulations, which, once this was popularized in China, just had a detrimental effect on the public opinion of vaccines. There was actually a study done by Harbin Medical University on the public opinion of vaccines in China following the Changxing incident. This is their data from that study. And so you can see that they split it up by age group, by 10 years, going from 20 all the way to 50, and then there's the total over there on the ends. The maroon bar is the confidence level, those who responded that they were confident, the percentage. And then the purple bar is those who responded that they were not confident. You can see that it's pretty constant across all of these levels, and then the total level, all of these added together, is right at 30% confident and 70% not confident. One important distinction that these researchers established in this study is that most people don't have a problem with vaccination if it works as intended. They don't have a problem with the idea of vaccination. They more have a problem with the safety of vaccination and if they are safe enough to use for the public. This single Changxing incident, this single event, had, as you can see, a detrimental effect on the Chinese public's trust in vaccination. Now, a contrasting example, there are a lot of other countries whose public opinion is not that of China and who have a very positive opinion towards vaccines. So in Saudi Arabia, asthma is on the rise. There are more cases every year of asthma, both in children and adults. And respiratory infection is the leading cause associated with this condition, with this disease. Now, a group of researchers from Curious did a study with a lot of Saudi Arabian parents of how they felt about the influenza vaccine for their children, specifically with asthma. And they show that parents in Saudi Arabia are very positive towards the influenza vaccine. They show that they are very trusting and they truly believe that their children need to get this vaccine in order to remain safe. They also show that there was, in this case, for example, there was a positive correlation between education level and vaccination, meaning that the parents who were higher educated, who had a higher education, were more likely to vaccinate their children than those who had a lower level of education. They also showed that parents aged 21 to 40 are far more likely to have their children vaccinated than those aged 40 and over. Now, public perception can be affected by a lot of things, and vaccination affects all of society. There are worries on both sides of this debate from towards the other side of what our actions can have on the entire public, on the country and society as a whole. So a lot of pro-vaccination believers are worried about the elimination of herd immunity. Herd immunity is acquired when a high enough percentage of a population is immune against a certain disease. And so certain members of that population who might not have that immunity against that disease have a very low chance of acquiring that infection or contracting that disease because everyone else around them is immune as well. And so they have an effective immunity against it. That's what herd immunity is. So this begins to break down if there's a high enough percentage of people in the population who aren't immune to that disease. A lot of people who believe in vaccination believe that the herd immunity, once it breaks down, can endanger them or their children specifically. For example, in 2010, tens of thousands of people in America suffered from pertussis, or whooping cough, and this disease was thought to be almost eliminated within America due to vaccination. But this and many other conditions like measles and mumps continue to be on the rise because of more and more people who choose not to vaccinate. Again, also there's an increased risk of childhood sickness because a lot of these diseases affect children specifically. Now, on the other hand, worries of anti-vaccination believers, they worry that there's unnecessary health risks associated with vaccines that they would be giving to their children. Again, they believe that they see that a lot of these chemicals that are in vaccines haven't been researched enough. Their safety hasn't been researched enough in infants specifically to see if it's safe for children to receive these vaccines and receive all of these chemicals that they get when they're very, very young. They believe that receiving these vaccines or giving them to their children just presents an unnecessary health risk and things that they could avoid if they didn't have the vaccine, and that their children would be able to fight off the infection if they got it anyway. Now, the government has often stepped in, and this just works to increase the controversy a lot of times. So there are regulations on vaccination. Massachusetts was the first state to require vaccinations in 1855, and this is most often done today by not allowing children to attend school if they don't have their vaccinations. Massachusetts was the first state, again, but now all 50 states have some regulations against vaccination. Those vary from state to state, but again, all 50 have at least some regulations. A lot of people can question whether this requirement for vaccination can affect our constitutional rights. And a really big Supreme Court case from that was Jacobson versus Massachusetts in 1905. And a very important decision was made by the Supreme Court in this case. And they stated that the government has the right to take away certain liberties of individuals in order to stop the spread of a harmful, contagious disease, which they were meaning they have the right to require vaccination in order to stop the spread of disease. Now, there are exemptions to vaccination. Medical exemptions are those in which a person or a child has a pre-existing condition in which if they received a vaccination, their health would be compromised. Religious exemptions are those whose religion don't allow them to receive vaccines, for example. And then philosophical exemptions are those whose people have beliefs in which they can't receive vaccines, but they don't necessarily line up with a certain religion. Now, only 17 states, have philosophical exemptions, but almost all of them have religious and medical exemptions. Now, specifically to go back to religious, lots of religions are affected by vaccination and have opinions on it. We're just going to look at two today that have high opinions on vaccination. So the Islamic faith, consumption of unclean animals for Islamic people is seen as wrong and bad. So, for example, pigs are seen as unclean animals. But the Islamic Organization for Medical Science, the IOMS, in 1995, made a decision that it is all right for Islamic people to receive vaccinations that have components of unclean animals in them. However, the Indonesian Ulema Council, or MUI, in 2008 said they made the opposite decision for a certain vaccine against meningitis that had porcine components. and they said that this vaccine was not okay for Islamic people to receive because of what's in it. Now, the difference in these decisions made a lot of controversy, and it definitely can confuse a lot of people, especially a lot of Islamic people, who are trying to decide if it's okay for them to receive these vaccines for their safety or if it's not because of their religious beliefs. These councils were later rectified to make their decisions agree, but that time between when those decisions disagreed showed a lot of controversy. Now, the Jewish faith faces a lot of similar battles with pig components in vaccines, but there's also a specific sentiment that's very popular in the Jewish population that can contribute a lot to anti-vaccination beliefs, and this is called intellectual independence. Now, this belief is just that every person is entitled to their own beliefs, and specifically that parents aren't entitled to blindly trust medical professionals on the safety of vaccines, especially for their children. So this sentiment is very strong in Jewish populations, and it contributes a lot to anti-vaccination belief. Now, these religions are not the only ones that are affected by vaccination, nor are these religions contained just within the US, but vaccination has received a lot of attention worldwide, and specifically in low and middle income countries. A lot of people have tried to introduce vaccination into those countries to reduce a lot of diseases that could be stopped by vaccination. For instance, in 2010, 87% of high-income countries used the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, which is opposed by only 2% of low-income countries utilize this vaccine in their normal vaccine regimen. Now, the World Health Assembly started the Global Vaccine Action Plan in 2012. This plan had a lot of lofty goals and sought to increase the access to vaccines worldwide, and they sought to increase sustainable access to these vaccines. And one of their goals was to provide universal access to vaccines across the world by the end of 2012. Now, the University of Queensland actually did a study across 24 nations trying to see what beliefs necessarily contributed to anti-vaccination beliefs or vaccination beliefs and why people believed one way or another. And one specific area of their study, which was very interesting, related to the relationship between individualism and hierarchy as opposed when concerned with anti-vaccination. So individualism is the belief that individuals have the right to make their own decisions, which is opposed by communitarianism, which is saying that government or communities have the right to make these decisions for individuals. And hierarchy is the belief that hierarchy or power differences in a society are natural and needed, as opposed to the belief that society needs more equality and egalitarianism. Now, what's interesting about this study is that the researchers found that there is sometimes a correlation between these beliefs in a society and anti-vaccination beliefs within the population. So, for instance, India and Indonesia showed that they had the highest level of correlation between individualism, hierarchy, and anti-vaccination beliefs. However, these are not just the only obstacles that face vaccination across the world, and costs are definitely a big obstacle for vaccinations. So once again, on a global scale, the Global Vaccine Action Plan, just to give you an example of how much this would cost, that would cost $57 billion in order to achieve all of their goals, which is expensive for a government for sure. But even if you go down to the individual level, Vaccines for Children is a program which tries to give eligible children pay for all of their vaccines that they would receive. And in 2000, they paid for about 35% of the American births, and this cost $500 million for just 35% of the births. And also there's a rising number of compulsory vaccines every year or few years that are required for each child to get. Now the University of Michigan did a study to try and estimate these costs and see how these costs would change over the past few years. They looked at a lot of trends of how the costs of vaccines changed before the year 2002 to try and estimate these costs. And this was also on the model that there would be 7 additional vaccines added to the normal regimen that you receive when you're a child by the year 2020, which is comparable to how many new vaccines were added before the year 2000. Now, it started over here at $385 back in 2002 per child to receive all of their vaccines. And they estimated that by 2020, it would be $1,225 to receive all of the vaccines. They also importantly showed that there's a 19% increase every year per average on the cost of vaccines increases every year. Now, in summary, vaccination is all-encompassing. It dips its toes into all areas of society, and all people need to be educated on this topic because it involves so many different things. Vaccines are intended to help, but they can hurt a lot of times if they aren't properly researched and the safety isn't established. Also, when governments step in, it can be very controversial, and a lot of people can talk about if governments are taking away their rights by requiring these things. But what's seen on both sides, whether you believe in vaccination or don't believe in vaccination, what's seen a lot of times is most people just want what's best for their children, for them and their children specifically. It's important for all of us to remain educated and for everyone to know what they believe on this topic. Thank you guys so much for listening to this slideshow. I look forward to the discussion later this week, and I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say. Thank you.